Section 1 of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Julie Burks. The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897, Section 1, Her Bare Foot, by William C. Hudson. Remember, her bare foot. These words were whispered into my ear one night last winter, as at the close of a performance I was pressing through the lobby of the Empire Theater in New York. Startled, I impulsively turned to the left, from which side they seemed to come. A tall, elderly gentleman was at my shoulder, but he was talking animatedly to the lady on his arm. He could not have been the whisperer. Behind me was a bevy of young girls, chattering like magpies, under the convoy of a sedate matron. It could not have been either of these. On my immediate right, an ex-mayor of the city and a celebrated lawyer discussed the play. Certainly it was neither of these. I was puzzled and annoyed. In the tone of the whisper there was warning and another quality. What? That I could not determine, yet it incited me to quarrel with somebody. But on looking about, I could find no eligible person to quarrel with. From the theater I went for my midnight chop and mug of ale. The mysterious incident lingered with me. I could not dismiss it. Whose bare foot? What about it? Why should I remember it? Answers were not forthcoming. Within my knowledge was nothing to which the whispered words could have relation. Vexed with myself that I should give so much heed to the incident and permit it to spoil the enjoyment of my meal, I left the chop-house in a temper with myself. Before doing so, I transferred my latch key from a pocket of my trousers to one in my top coat, for the night was cold, and I protected myself against delay and the opening of my coat at the street door. During my walk home, it seemed to me that everybody that passed, even the cab horses, whispered those irritating words to me. I am quite certain that at 33rd Street, Horace Greeley bent down from his granite perch to do so, and I know I detected in his stony eyes a leer, a malicious leer. When, on reaching my street door, I put my hand into my pocket for the latch key, I felt a slip of paper. I took it out with the key. Under the dimly burning hall light, I examined it. On it was written in a hand with which I was not familiar, "Remember, her bare foot. Be prepared." I was shocked. Hurrying to my room, I studied the slip. The writing was that of a man of education and of one accustomed to the use of the pen. This the slip indicated, and nothing more, except that it proved that the whisper in the theater lobby was not a trick of the imagination, as I had been trying to persuade myself. Mystified, I went to bed, but to an uneasy and dream-haunted sleep, in which bare feet of all sizes and shapes floated in the air, twinkled their pink toes, or winked, or grinned, or leered at me, while one persistent foot planted itself on my chest to inform me that it had knowledge of all my peccadilloes. The morning found me nervous and unrefreshed. However, had it not been for the indubitable evidence of the slip of paper lying on my table, I think I might have dismissed the incident as the effect of disordered imagination, but there it was to tell its tale. That morning I had an appointment with Chester Williams, a kindred soul in a hobby of mine, amateur photography, and who, being as an amateur and ending as an adept, had opened a suite of rooms which he called a studio, having a high regard for his art. Here I was accustomed to spend much time and experiment to his profit and my pleasure. As I entered the studio, Williams handed me a letter. "Found it on the floor," he said briefly. Taking the letter, I glanced at the address and started visibly. I was familiar with the writing now at least. There was no doubt about the address. Charles Haswell, Esquire, care of Mr. Chester Williams, present. I tore off the envelope, the same kind of a slip of paper as I had found in my pocket. On it was written, "Remember, her bare foot. Be prepared. Do not leave town." I was dumbfounded. None of my correspondents and few of my friends knew of my visits to Williams's studio. Who was this mysterious person who was whispering warnings and writing imploring memoranda to me to remember somebody's bare foot? I handed the slip to Williams. "What does it mean?" he asked. "That's what I want to know," I replied. I told him the story of the previous evening. Chester is a cheerful and optimistic youth. "Pooh!" he said, with a wave of the hand, dismissing the whole matter. "Some of your friends are constructing an elaborate joke." Then he drove the matter from my mind by a proposition well according with my fancy. He had received an extensive order for a series of views in another state, and he proposed that in his absence, a fortnight or more, I should conduct his studio. "I doubt if there will be much to do," he said. "The damsel who wants to be took beautiful is not much in evidence here. If she does put in an appearance, you will have a chance to spoil some plates and exploit your theories on the art of posing." I yielded without urging, and as we parted at evening, he said, "I don't know that I have anything to say, except to advise you to sit on that boy of mine every 10 minutes, for your own sake, you know, and to beware of the fascination of the young saleslady who has dubbed herself the cashier of the establishment." On my way home, I stopped at the tobacconist's, where I buy my cigars. "A boy left this for you, Mr. Haswell," said the man of tobacco, handing me a letter. The same writing, the same slip of paper. "Remember her bare foot. Postponed. Await further notice." By this time surprise had given way to anger. I tore the slip into bits. Moreover, it was depressing. The persistency with which I was followed by these notes, and the knowledge evidenced by this man in the dark of my habits and customs, it was positively weird and uncanny. After this, the notes ceased, for a while at least, and I was free to devote myself with undisturbed mind to Williams's studio. His predictions were verified. There was little to do, and I made sad havoc among his chemicals and materials with my experiments. Several days had passed very pleasantly, and I had almost forgotten the affair of the whisper, when the cashier came to me in the camera room. She was in a condition of virtuous indignation. Up to this time, apparently resenting the idea of my being in charge of the establishment, she had merely tolerated my existence. Now she came to give me orders. "There is a woman in the reception room you must see," she said. There was trouble for me. I knew it from the peculiar emphasis our cashier gave to the word woman, and I further knew that she had a poor opinion of our visitor, even doubts as to her moral character. "What is it?" I asked as professionally as I could. "She wants to have a picture taken undressed. I want you to send her away." The cashier sniffed most virtuously. "What?" I exclaimed, filled with the same virtuous indignation. I dropped everything, determined to preserve the spotless purity of Williams's studio, even at the peril of my temper. I went at once to the reception room, but I was unprepared for the appearance of the woman whose errand was fraught with such danger to the good repute of the establishment. A less likely person for a sitting in scant drapery it would have been difficult to conceive. Gray-haired, 60 if a day, 200 if she weighed a pound, her broad and ample figure was the very antithesis of Venus or Juno or Hebe or Helen or any other of those ancient ladies whose faces were their fortunes. The cashier had made a sad blunder. So, instead of meeting the woman fiercely, I mildly asked her wishes. Though the cashier was mistaken in the reply of the woman, I received as great a shock as if she had asked to be taken in the character of Mother Eve. She desired to know if we would take a picture of a bare foot. The mysterious affair was up in a new form. I was confused for the moment. All sorts of possibilities crowded upon my mind. But dimly through my consciousness stole the sense of her words. It was not her bare foot, but that of another person that was to be photographed, and if we consented, she would be back in an hour with that person. We consented. With all the severity I could summon, I upbraided the cashier for her blunder, trembling as I thought how a degree, more or less, of officiousness on her part might have put it beyond my power to get possession of a string to the mystery of the warnings. As it was, I was now to see the person owning the foot and the foot itself that I had been so solemnly and mysteriously conjured to remember. I awaited the flight of the hour with impatience. Promptly at its expiration, I was notified by the cashier, now properly humbled, that the foot had arrived and was in the dressing-room. I busied myself with the arrangements, and in a few moments, under the chaperonage of the old woman, the foot entered, closely veiled. An increase of the mystery, not its elucidation. That she was young was abundantly manifest in the outlines of her figure, in her movement and carriage, but not a glimpse of her face could I secure. When I had recovered from my confusion and disappointment, I requested her to mount the platform I had prepared for her. She complied with a slight bow, holding out a hand to me to assist her, a hand from which I formed several conclusions, to wit, that she was unmarried, since no wedding ring encircled her third finger, of wealth, since there was a year's liberal income on her fingers in valuable jewels, of the leisure class, since her hand was white, well-kept, soft, unaccustomed to manual labor, not even pricked or roughened by the needle. Why or how I became conscious that she was regarding me with marked interest, it is difficult for me to tell, as I could not see her eyes, but I was distinctly conscious of it, and it did not aid me in going about my work with composure. However, having secured my focus, I asked her how she desired to have the picture. For the first time since she had been in the room she spoke, telling me that she wanted 4 negatives, a front and rear, and 2 side views. I gave less attention to her words than to her voice and the manner of her speech, and by them I judged her to be an educated, refined, and well-bred person. As yet she had not exposed her foot, but now at my request she thrust it forward, lifting her skirt so that it barely cleared her instep. I shook my head. That would not do. Taking a footstool, I threw a piece of black velvet over it and went to her. As I approached, she withdrew her foot. The act was prompted, apparently, by instinctive modesty. I seized the opportunity to seek the information I was burning to obtain. Telling her that as she had posed the result would not be an attractive picture, I showed her that a photograph of a foot, of which no more than the instep was displayed, would scarcely be pretty, certainly not artistic. That such a pose might or might not serve her purpose, but unless I was enlightened as to that purpose, she stood in danger of defeating it. She was silent for a moment, the while the old woman looked up anxiously at her. Then she laughingly said, "Suppose mere vanity is my purpose." Such was not her purpose, as I immediately saw by the expression of the old woman's face, but I replied, "Then vanity would not be satisfied. Your pose would make neither a pretty nor an artistic picture." After a moment's silence she said, "Make an artistic picture." I had failed, clearly shown by the smile of relief on the old woman's face. I put the stool on the platform before her, asking her to place her foot upon it, and to raise her skirt 2 or 3 inches higher than she had done before. She complied, hesitatingly to be sure, but complied nevertheless. No further encouragement to conversation was given me, and I was forced to finish my work with brief remarks to which she made no replies. The sitting ended, and I was no wiser. As she descended from the platform, I was summoned to the reception-room by the cashier. A gentleman wanted a letter photographed. The gentleman, prompt and decided in manner, and keen in expression, was anxious to know whether the letter he held in his hand could be taken at once. "My time is limited," he said, "and this letter cannot go out of my sight." I assured him that, provided there were no difficulties in the letter itself, I could take it immediately, and that during the process it need not be out of his view. For answer he handed it to me. At the moment the 2 women entered the room, going to the cashier. I paused to listen. It appeared that they did not wish to give their names, that they would pay the full price for the dozen in advance, and the elder woman would call for the photographs when finished. This being adjusted, while the latter was paying the money, her companion went to the mirror to arrange her veil. I gave my attention to the letter. It was with difficulty that I could suppress my excitement. Staring out of the body of the letter, as if written in crimson ink, were these 3 words, "Her bare foot." I know my hand trembled as I shot a swift glance at the young woman, and in that glance I caught a glimpse of her face, as for a moment she pulled her veil aside, a most attractive face, at once indelibly impressed on my memory. Turning from the mirror, she came into close proximity with the man of the letter, but was apparently indifferent to his presence. The elder woman also looked at the man a moment, while he cast a careless glance on both. I, watching eagerly, could not see that there was recognition, or surprise, or disturbance, or any other emotion on the part of any one of the 3. The 2 women went out after bidding me good-bye, the elder in words, the younger by a courteous inclination of the head. The man merely evinced impatience that I did not proceed with his affair. I was the agitated person. Finally, becoming sufficiently master of myself, I asked him to accompany me to the camera room, burning to read the letter, but fearing to show my curiosity. It did not take long to get 2 negatives, and during the process the man watched the letter closely. In the dark room I assured myself that I had 2 perfect copies. Now, anxious to have him go, I hastened to tell him when he could have the copies in a finished state. "You will not need this letter again?" he asked. "No. Are you quite sure?" he persisted. "This letter will pass out of my hands this afternoon, and it is unlikely that I can obtain it again." I confidently assured him that I had 2 perfect negatives. He was satisfied, and in the reception-room paid the required deposit, giving his name and address, Edward Harbeck, Columbus Hotel, City. There is as great a perversity in events as there is in persons. The damsel who wanted to be took beautiful was very much in evidence that afternoon, multiplied several-fold. Heretofore my afternoons had been my own, but now, when I was feverishly anxious to devote myself to the letter, which promised to shed light on the mystery, my time was occupied by sitters as long as the day lasted. That evening, however, I was able to read it at my leisure, and this was it. Philadelphia, January 5, 1896. Dear Tim, the affair is progressing well enough. To land a fish of the value of the one we are after isn't the work of an hour. Certain things had to be done. I had to find out whether Haswell knows anything of Atwood. He doesn't. Then whether young Atwood knows anything of Haswell and her bare foot. I am certain now that he doesn't. Somebody was good enough to walk away with enough of old Atwood's papers to spoil young Atwood's education on that point. But you keep on with Haswell's education, and let him get accustomed to the idea that others as well as himself have knowledge of her bare foot. Meanwhile, I'll dust around after that bit of paper we want so much. Yours, Jim. I was not surprised to find my name in the letter. In fact, I expected it. But I was conscious of 2 distinct emotions, perplexity and disappointment. The mystery was deepened, and the complications increased. Another factor, and with a name had entered. Who was this Atwood of whom I knew nothing, and who knew nothing of me and her bare foot? And how confident this Jim was that I knew all about somebody's bare foot? The more I considered the affair, the more confused I became. Everything tended to mystification, nothing to elucidation. Another perusal suggested that something of value was involved in the mystery. Were Jim and Tim, whoever these worthies might be, engaged in a conspiracy to obtain that valuable something? So skillfully was the letter phrased that I could obtain no information from it. Everything was but conjecture. There was, however, the comforting assurance of no indications that my person or possessions were in peril, no threats of the capture of the one or attack upon the other. My personal dignity alone had been assailed, and a determination that I should not forget somebody's bare foot, some person or persons, had taken liberties with my peace of mind. If their anxiety was as to the veiled lady's foot, as I made quite certain, they could cease their efforts, for I was not likely to forget it, nor her face either. Both were very pretty. I was so perplexed that I could formulate neither ideas nor a plan of action, but I rose from my speculations, determined to solve the mystery if I could. I was engaged for dinner at the house of a cousin that evening, and went home early to prepare for it. On my table a letter awaited me. A glance at it revealed the now familiar writing, and enclosed was the same kind of a slip of paper. Remember her bare foot. The time grows near. The mysterious admonition created no excitement now. I merely endorsed the envelope with the time and place of its receipt, and began my preparations. The dinner was a more formal affair than I had anticipated, for the parlor was well filled when I appeared. As I entered, I was met by my cousin, who said, with an air of importance, "You will see how good I am to you when I present you to the lady you are to take into dinner." She led me across the room and to the veiled lady. "Miss Halliday," she said, "my favorite cousin, Mr. Haswell." I bowed. Miss Halliday looked up, and a vivid blush swept over her face. I knew she recognized me, and I was put into a very good humor with myself by the feeling that, on my part, I had betrayed no recognition of her. She was quickly at her ease, settling at once into the belief, as was plain, that she was not identified by me as the lady of the foot. It is nothing to the point of this story that the dinner was brilliant, or that I was charmed by Miss Halliday, her grace, her wit, and her vivacity. What was significant occurred after the guests had departed, and I had remained to smoke another cigar with my cousin's husband at his request. While we smoked, my cousin said, "Charlie, you have made an impression on a charming girl. Miss Halliday was persistent in her inquiries as to you while you were with the gentleman. Oh," he continued, "you did not suffer in my replies, but she asked me a most singular question, whether you were a photographer." "And your reply was what?" I asked composedly. "Why, of course that you were not, except as an amateur, that you are a man of leisure and independent circumstances. And now who is she?" "The sweetest girl in New York, my dearest friend, daughter of a widow who is an old friend of my mother." "Any mystery about her?" I asked lightly. "Mystery!" exclaimed my cousin. "No, indeed. I've known her all my life. Her father was one of the Hallidays of Westchester, all of which, however, was more mystery to me, for what could such a girl have to do with Jim and Tim and Atwood and Harbeck and her bare foot? But all I said was, "You'll take me to call on her?" My cousin's eager consent was almost drowned out by the burst of hearty laughter with which her husband exclaimed, "By Jove, a mutual case!" I left soon after. I may as well confess now as at another time that, mixed with wonder as to the relations Miss Halliday bore to the mystery, were thoughts of her charms, as I walked home in the crisp, cool night. While I was moving along at a rapid pace, my attention was attracted to two men approaching me. The collars of their coats were turned up, and their slouch hats were pulled down over their heads, so that I could not discern their features. As they came close to me, one bent down suddenly and peered into my face. I stepped aside quickly, thinking that an attack upon me was meditated, but the man assumed an erect position and, as he passed on, said, "Remember her bare foot." I shouted back on the impulse of the moment, "Yes, and Atwell as well." I walked on, but, looking back, was pleased to observe that my words had astonished them, for they had stopped short, looking at each other, the hand of one resting on the shoulder of the other. Before I went to sleep that night, I had a thought which gave me a cue to action, and which I put into effect the very next morning, when Mr. Harbeck came for the copies of the letters. As I handed him the package, I took him to one side, where we could not be overheard. "Mr. Harbeck," I said, "I have read that letter, and I would like to ask you some questions concerning it." He looked at me keenly for a moment, and then abruptly asked, "What do you know?" "Nothing, but I want to know a good deal." He again scrutinized me, as if he would read my thoughts. "My name is Haswell," I added. He was surprised and interested immediately. "Is it not Williams?" he asked. "No," I replied. "Mr. Williams is a friend who, being absent from town for some days, prevailed on me, who am only an amateur in the art, to take charge of his business. I have reason to believe that I am the Haswell referred to in that letter." He did not reply at once, but seemed to be deeply thinking. At last he said, "Do you understand that letter?" "Not at all." "We ought to compare notes, I imagine," he said, "but I don't want to give away my hand without knowing what I'm doing. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think you are the Haswell referred to?" "You are cautious," I replied, laughing. "On my part, I do not want to play into the hands of a possible opponent. I will ask a question. Are you the Jim or Tim of this letter?" "No," he replied promptly. "Now, I'll ask you another question. Do you know the Atwood mentioned?" "No, never heard of him before." He muttered, pondering a moment. "Well, I'm a private detective retained by this Atwood. What does her bare foot mean?" "That's what I want to know." "But this letter intimates that you do know." "All the same, I do not." Then I told him of the mysterious occurrences, including the visit of the veiled lady, but from an impulse I did not then stop to examine, concealed my knowledge of her. "Your story throws but little light on the matter," he said. "Certain valuable papers of the late Mr. Atwood's estate are missing. The present Mr. Atwood suspects a clerk named Holmes, who was in his father's employ. In the effort to trace these missing papers, I have made the acquaintance of a friend of Holmes, and have followed him to New York. The morning I first came here, I saw in his apartment this letter in the handwriting of Holmes, and taking it, hurried to have it photographed, returning it to its place afterwards." "Does Mr. Atwood know the meaning of 'her bare foot'?" I asked. "No," he replied. "I ran over to Philadelphia yesterday to consult him on that point. It would seem as if the interests of Mr. Atwood were involved in the mystery troubling me," I said. "That's just it. It is through you that things will come out, if they come at all. I mean to stick very closely to you," he said, with a laugh as he went off. It was my custom every evening, if only for a moment, to visit my mother, who, by reason of age and infirmities, was confined to her room. On the evening of this day, having no engagement abroad, I set myself down for a long chat with the old lady, a chat which I knew would be largely reminiscental, as the talk of very old people is apt to be. During the evening, and apropos of nothing, my mother asked, "You don't remember your Uncle Charles, do you?" Very indistinctly. "No, I suppose not. He ran away from home as a boy, and was back only once after that. He was a sad trial, the black sheep of the family." "What has brought him to your mind tonight, Mother?" I asked. "I found a paper of his today in a box into which I have not looked for years. Do you remember a very sudden trip I made to Boston when you were about 15? I did recollect it, for it was associated with other events, the memory of which had kept remembrance of her trip alive. I went to see your uncle. He was dying in a hospital there. It was at that time he gave me the paper and a small writing desk, which he said contained something valuable. He was near his end then, and died soon after. I searched the desk thoroughly, but could find nothing, nor could I make anything of the paper. Finally I laid them both away, and forgot them until today, when I stumbled on the paper." She handed it to me. At the first glance, the writing seemed to be merely an odd jumble of letters, but a careful scrutiny convinced me that it was a cipher. I told my mother so, and carried it to my room to study it undisturbed. It was rather from a desire to occupy my mind than with the hope of discovery that I began the search for the key. At midnight I was about to throw it aside unsolved, when I thought of a simple cipher with which as a boy I amused myself. What had suggested it was the word Worcester, written in small characters in one corner of the paper. Taking the first word of the cipher, Olep, I guessed it to be this. On making the effort, it worked out. The method was simplicity itself. Finding the word this in Worcester's dictionary, counting the letters, 4, and adding 10, making 14, I counted down to the 14th word after this, and taking the third letter of that 14th word and the 3 letters following, I spelled Olep. I had found the method of making the cipher. The first sentence of my uncle's paper read, Olep ka it tetechli fo raba rihe otafa. Having found the method of building the cipher, by reversing it, I was enabled to translate the line, and when I did, it can be imagined under what excitement I continued when it is known that the first line as translated read, This is the history of her bare foot. The morning light was streaming through the windows when I threw myself on the bed successful but exhausted by my labors. The history, briefly told, was that my uncle, in his vagrant ramblings over the world, had united fortunes with a man named Atwood from Philadelphia, and in their travels had reached the city of Pegu in the Burma Empire. 70 miles away were the celebrated ruby mines, and though warned not to do so, since the mines were closely guarded as the possession of the dominant prince, thither they went. While there, my uncle found what he supposed to be a common stone, but which Atwood, having some knowledge of geology and mineralogy, believed to be a valuable rose ruby. An outcry being raised against their presence, my uncle threw the stone away, for possession by a stranger was sufficient cause for death. But he and his companion were closely searched, and though nothing of value was found upon them, they were placed in confinement for some time. Atwood was the first one freed, and before leaving Pegu, managed to convey to my uncle the information that he was going to Calcutta and would wait a reasonable time for him there. Some weeks after my uncle was released. On the day he was first at liberty, a native girl who was in association with him, how or why did not appear, came to him with the stone. When my uncle had thrown it away, unobserved by the guards, it had fallen near where this girl was standing, and she had concealed it by the simple method of putting her foot upon it. While my uncle and Atwood were being searched, she had closed her long and flexible toes over it, and without attracting attention, had managed to convey it, held by her toes, to a spot where she could conceal it without detection. Frightened by its very possession, my uncle hurriedly departed from Pegu. What became of the native girl was not told, but my uncle reached Calcutta in safety, where he met Atwood and admitted that person's right to a half-interest in the stone. They called it her bare foot, in honor of the foot that had saved it for them. Having agreed to dispose of the stone, they next quarreled as to who should have possession of it, pending realization. My uncle prevailed, but the quarrel separated the two, for they parted after having written her bare foot on a piece of paper, tearing it into 2 parts, each taking one, and entering into a written agreement that the part should represent the interest of its possessor in the stone. What became of the two thereafter, or why they never met nor communicated with each other, the record did not disclose. What followed in the statement was in the nature of a will or charge that I, his nephew, named for him, should inherit his interest, that I should have the stone cut and, disposing of it, pay over 1/2 of the net proceeds to Atwood if alive, or if dead, then to his heirs, and declaring that the stone was in a secret recess of the small writing desk. There was an anxious hour before the desk was found, a castaway in a lumber room, and further anxiety until the spring of the secret recess was discovered. There it was, still in the rough, wrapped in faded yellow tissue paper, the largest ruby I ever saw or expect to see again. With the stone was a torn slip with the words, "Refoot." I sent for Mr. Harbeck early that morning and told him of my discovery. He immediately suggested that Holmes, having come across a similar paper among Mr. Atwood's documents, and finding that young Atwood had no knowledge of it, had determined to set up a claim for the half-interest, and had begun operations on me in the belief that I had inherited the stone. This turned out to be the exact truth, and Harbeck, through the knowledge thus obtained, compelled Holmes to yield up the stolen papers. Mr. Atwood was so much pleased over the recovery of these papers, since they settled all doubts as to his interests in very valuable property, that he refused to take his share in the proceeds of the stone, saying that I was entitled to all for the service I had rendered in the restoration of his own property. At the time, neither of us knew the value of the stone. Her bare foot has been cut in Amsterdam, and is certainly the largest ruby known outside of Ceylon, much, much the largest. Perhaps the sensation created in Europe last summer by the Bulgarian Emperor's purchase of a ruby for 1,000,000 francs is recalled by this story. That ruby was her bare foot. The veiled lady? Ah. Well, you see, Miss Halliday had nothing whatever to do with the mystery. That was the great joke. She had only stumbled, as it were, into it, and at a time when it served to confuse and complicate it. She had a cousin who was a sculptor, and who wanted to model her foot, but her mother objected so strenuously, not so much to the sitting as to the man himself, that the daughter compromised matters by stealing away with an old servant and having photographs taken for the sculptor's use. The best joke of all is that Miss Halliday has given herself to me in marriage, and though I have disposed of her bare foot, I am still the owner of her bare foot. End of section 1.
Section 2 of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. Section 2. Miss Phoebe and Mr. Lorton by Charles Sloan Reid. The big, square, weather-worn house looked in its silence and isolation like the relic of a long dead past. Not the abandoned relic, however, for the hand of a painstaking florist and gardener was in evidence in the little yard on which the house fronted. Flowers, everywhere flowers. Geraniums, dahlias, bachelor's buttons, lilacs, and syringas in their season, and always roses, red and white and yellow, filled the flower beds and crowded against the fence, giving of their fragrance to every passer-by. And from floor to roof of the long piazza, a matted mass of moonflower vines softened the entering sunlight. In spite of the flowers, however, there was such an atmosphere of sacred quiet about the house that except for the presence of a tabby cat on the piazza, it would have seemed to be uninhabited. But any urchin along the street could have told you who lived there. It was Miss Phoebe. Well, the question, how long has she lived there, would invariably have brought the answer, she's always lived there. And indeed, for more than 25 years, that part of the outskirts of the city had known the good works of Miss Phoebe's charitable and kindly hand. How old Miss Phoebe was, no one knew, unless perhaps it was the aged family servant, Aunt Dinah, who was her only companion. Nor, indeed, did anyone care to know. It was enough that she was still young in the beautiful attributes of heart and mind. Just across the street from Miss Phoebe's residence stood a plain, grim, old two-story building whose front doorstep abutted on the pavement. To add to its forbidding aspect, the front window blinds were always closed, and the sombre appearance of the place awed the eye with its suggestion of melancholy. As of the other house across the way, anyone in the neighborhood could have told you who the occupant was, and of him, too, would have said that he had always lived there. Certainly every morning for more than 25 years, Mr. Lorton had been seen to issue from his front door punctually at 7 o'clock, in order to ride down to the city in the old horse-car which passed at that hour. And from her window Miss Phoebe had watched his departure each morning, and noted his return at evening by the faint glow of a light through the chinks of the ever-closed blinds. A chance sojourner in that part of the city must have wondered what were the forces governing those two lives in their orbital range. Mr. Lorton was quiet, almost to mysteriousness. His step was always the same, his movements, the expression of his face, his attire, in fact, his whole personality seemed, except for a few gray hairs and added lines, unchanged in a quarter of a century. What might be the real man behind the mask, no one knew, for more than a bow in passing Mr. Lorton seldom bestowed upon anyone. As for Miss Phoebe, though she sighed sometimes when she saw him come and go in his apparent cheerlessness, she seemed to know little of her neighbor, as did the rest of the suburban residents, but pruned her shrubs and trained her vines and flowers, and scarcely ever spoke of the lonely man across the way. All this is the sum of the impressions made upon those among whom those two solitaries lived. Sometimes in the quiet seclusion of her own home, Miss Phoebe's eye softened with a tender light, as the whisperings of memory recounted the scenes of other years. With memory's pulsations came the song notes of birds whose music had a peculiar significance, and the breath of flowers that were sweet with a peculiar fragrance. But the ebb succeeding the flow carried back to the depths of the past the quickened sensations, and Miss Phoebe lived again in her present sympathies. Thus had passed 25 years, when, one morning, there occurred an unprecedented break in the chain forged by long habit. The old horse-car passed down on its 7 o'clock trip, and Mr. Lorton failed to make his appearance. Naturally, Miss Phoebe was moved from her wonted placidity, as one planet in a system is disturbed by the least erratic movement of another in its orbit. All through the long hours of the morning she watched the door of the house across the street for the appearance of its owner, but at last she was forced to conclude that some important engagement must have called him forth before the fixed hour of his rising. Surely such an irregularity must precipitate the little suburban social system, for a day at least, into some unheard-of disorder. But the day passed much as had other days. Only Miss Phoebe felt the disturbance, and, as time wore on, her uneasiness, too, lost itself in the little events of the hour. Late in the afternoon she went about the yard, attending the flowers with her usual care. Along the little old picket fence that marked the limits of the yard, the bluebirds fluttered happily, their softly tinted plumage beautiful in the rays of the sinking sun, while the music of their peculiar noting accorded harmoniously with the rose fragrance of Miss Phoebe's flower garden. There was a small square hole in the side of one of the gate-posts, where a pair of the prettiest of the blue-coated songsters had nested every year, feeling secure from molestation under Miss Phoebe's kindly protection. It was a season of the year when summer begins to sink slowly into the arms of autumn, turning the ephemeral roses of her lips to the solvent kiss of her maturer and more lovely sister. As the early twilight gathered, the song notes of the bluebirds grew less frequent and more plaintive, and when Miss Phoebe had completed her pleasant task, she strolled down to the little gate, and leaned against the low railing to listen to them, and to watch the golden sunset, whose central glory illuminated the end of the long street, whose lines converged to that splendid point in the distance. From time to time she glanced at the closed house over the way. It was silent and still. It was not yet time for the return of Mr. Lorton, if he had gone away that morning. While Miss Phoebe was leaning against the little gate, her spirit drifting with the gentle current of happy memories, she was suddenly startled from her dreamland voyage by a strange noise in the post at her side. Quickly she glanced round, just in time to see a rat leap from the little square hole in the post, dragging with it to the ground the debris of a bluebird's nest of the season past. The agile rodent scampered away amongst the ground-clinging vines, and Miss Phoebe stooped down to pick up the nest. It seemed the first time that the little square hole had ever been empty, and as she arose, she stopped to peer into the long-inhabited shelter of the nesting birds, now cleared of its little specimen of bird architecture. As she glanced into the cavity, her eye caught sight of some white object far back in its depths. After trying in vain to make out what it was, she picked up a little stick, and thrusting it into the hole, encountered what? It seemed only a piece of waste paper, yet at the sight of it, Miss Phoebe straightened up and leaned forward with one elbow placed on top of the old fence post, while her breath came and went in little quick gasps. What was there about the finding of that bit of paper to set the gossips of memory a-whispering over the scenes and incidents of a long ago? Little, apparently, and yet Miss Phoebe was listening to the whisperings. Finally, with an effort, she roused herself, and this time dragged the little paper from the hole. Perhaps the bluebirds had carried it in, and finding it unavailable for their use, had pushed it to the rear out of their way. At any rate, it had evidently lain there for many years, as the curves of the watermarks were brown with age. Half eagerly, half fearfully, she unfolded the little sheet, and, although the twilight was deepening, and Miss Phoebe's eyes were not as strong as they once were, she read on until the last faded letter was deciphered. Then, without a sound, she sank down and buried her face in her hands. It was almost dark when Miss Phoebe finally dragged herself up from the damp grass and entered the house. Once inside the stately old drawing-room, she drew the folded paper from her bosom and again read it over, while 2 tears coursed slowly down her cheeks. It was strange that this bit of paper should bring up recollections of a nature to start tears from the eyes of one ordinarily so even-tempered and sweetly disposed. But whatever the contents of the sheet, Miss Phoebe placed a peculiar valuation upon it. That was evident from the solemn care with which she approached an old brown cabinet which stood in a corner of the room, and, taking therefrom a little rosewood casket, laid the scrap of paper within it. Then she turned out the light and crept to the window, where she sat looking out across the way. Evidently she was still uneasy about her neighbor, for there was no light from his window, nor did one appear while Miss Phoebe watched, although it was late when she retired. The following morning she again took her place by the window, but the horse-car passed, and Mr. Lorton had not appeared. During the day Miss Phoebe called Aunt Dinah to her room. "Aunt Dinah," she said, "I believe something has happened to Mr. Lorton, or he is ill over there in that house, all alone." "I spec you done said it 'bout right, Miss Phoebe, 'cause I ain't seen him to-day, nor yistiddy, neither." "Oh, Aunt Dinah, it would be awful if he should die there all alone," and Miss Phoebe turned away her head. The afternoon wore away. Aunt Dinah moved about the house noiselessly, and Miss Phoebe remained seated near the window, where she might observe any movement in the house across the street. At length the shadows began to grow long, and the anxiety of Miss Phoebe's charitable heart overcame her patience. "Aunt Dinah," she said, as she passed through the hallway, "I am going to Mr. Lorton's. I feel that it is my duty, for I am sure he must be ill. And think, Aunt Dinah, if he should die there with no one." Surely the sweet voice trembled. "With no one to hear his last words." Out in the yard she sought among the late flowers till she found a single white rose almost ready to scatter its petals. This she plucked, then, passing through the gateway, crossed the street. The Lorton house was an old-fashioned one, with a street door at the end of an open piazza. Through this doorway Miss Phoebe entered, and advanced along the piazza, made dark and gloomy by the dense, untrimmed growth of the shrubbery in the little side yard. Approaching the door of what was probably Mr. Lorton's lodging apartment, she tapped gently upon the panel. After a moment, a weak voice from within said, "Come in." Miss Phoebe hesitated a moment, while she felt the blood rush to her temples. Then she firmly turned the knob and entered. It was a dark, old-fashioned room, rendered still darker by the heavy shutters. But, as Miss Phoebe's eyes accustomed themselves to the gloom, she made out, huddled on a bed near the window, a tossing figure. At the sound of her step, the figure turned, revealing the dazed, fever-bright eyes of Mr. Lorton. Then a hand wandered toward a table that stood at the head of the bed, and on which rested a pitcher of water, a goblet, and, yes, Miss Phoebe drew a long breath as she saw that the hand was reaching for a little box, in which lay the long, seared petals of a once red rose. With a swift impulse, Miss Phoebe placed the white rose over the withered petals of the red one. Then laying her cool hand on the hot fingers of the sick man, she said gently, "You are ill. Why didn't you send for someone? For me?" The eyes of the sick man met hers with a half-dazed expression. Then he turned to the wall. "I know you," he muttered. "You seem real, but you're not. You, with your white rose." A spasm of fear stole the pink from Miss Phoebe's cheeks, but still she clasped the twitching hand firmly in her own. "Listen," she said. "I'm going to send for a doctor now, at once, and then I will come back and take care of you." Again the fevered eyes turned to hers, and again they sought the wall. "No use," murmured the hoarse voice. "No use to live. No future. No one who cares. Only red roses. Red roses." But his visitor, her soft gray eyes misted with tears, was already hurrying across the street, and though it was dark, Aunt Dinah was dispatched at once for a doctor, while Miss Phoebe, hastily gathering from her stores such remedies as she thought might relieve the sick man, hastened back to his bedside. For more than a fortnight Mr. Lorton lay in the grip of the fever, attended daily by the physician, and hourly by a gray-eyed little woman who always wore in the folds of her dark gown a single white rose. Was there in the look or fragrance of that flower some talismanic power of healing? If so, the fact was not set down in the doctor's case-book, but even the physician acknowledged that after the crisis was past, the rapid convalescence of his patient seemed almost miraculous. 3 weeks from the night that his neighbor made her first call, he had improved so rapidly that Miss Phoebe ceased from her visits, though each day she sent Aunt Dinah with little delicacies and cordial inquiries. Finally, one golden autumn evening, Mr. Lorton took his first walk down the suburban street, an occasion long remembered by the neighbors, who marked with delight the old kindly smile and his wonted pleasant though short bow of greeting. It was soon after his departure that Miss Phoebe stole out to the front gate to indulge in her favorite recreation, that of watching the sunset at the far end of the street, so soon that, wrapped in her twilight reveries, she had no thought of his return until she looked up and saw him pausing before her gate. As his eyes met hers, she flushed ever so slightly, stammered some little phrase of pleasure for his recovery, and then turned toward the house. "Phoebe," said Mr. Lorton. The rose flush on Miss Phoebe's cheeks grew to crimson as she again leaned her elbow on the gate. "Well, John!" He put out his hand, in which she allowed her own to rest for a moment. "Phoebe, it's 25 years since we used to stand and talk here. together at sunset. But is the little post-office still open in the old gate-post?" "It is open now. But, oh, John!" exclaimed Miss Phoebe, burying her face in her hands, "I did not get your last letter until the day before I found you ill." "Phoebe, Phoebe!" cried Mr. Lorton, gently drawing her hands away from her face. The tears stood in her eyes, and John thought them a gentle shower that freshened the springtime beauty of her life. "Have you got the letter now? Let me see it." He drew open the gate and went inside, while Miss Phoebe took the little scrap of paper from her bosom and gave it to him. There was a rustic settee near the gate, on which they seated themselves. There Mr. Lorton read the words that he had penned more than 25 years before. The letter was undated, and read: "My dear Phoebe, you tell me you are going away in the morning, to be gone a whole month, a length of time that to me will seem a whole year. I feel that I cannot let you go away without some token. I have tried to express, not only in words, but in 1,000 other ways, my consuming love for you. Now, O Phoebe, blessed angel of my dreams, send me a simple token before you go. Will you be my wife? May I hope? If I may, then send me a pure white rose. If I must no longer hope, then send me the blood-red rose, that I may see it in my own poor bleeding heart. Your ever devoted John." Mr. Lorton's hand, which held the letter, dropped to his knee. "And, Phoebe, you sent me a red rose that evening." "Oh, John, how could I know? It was by chance that I sent it as a token of remembrance. Then for some reason we went away that night instead of the next day, so that I never thought to look in the letter-box. When I came back a month later, the bluebirds had builded there, and it was only by accident that I ever received your letter, 25 years after it was written." Then, in a few broken phrases, she told of how the long-concealed bit of paper had been discovered, and of how, on the afternoon she found him ill, she had covered the withered petals of the red rose on his table with a fresh white one. But before she could finish, Mr. Lorton was close at her side, his hands outstretched. "Phoebe," he said hoarsely, if it was for more than common charity you brought me that rose, then give me now the answer I've missed for all these years." Without a word, Miss Phoebe reached out a trembling hand to a near-by rose-bush on which bloomed a single late white rose. Plucking the flower slowly, carefully, that she might not loosen a single petal, she held it out, still without a word. Quite as silently the man closed his fingers about that symbolic blossom and about the hand that gave it, and straightway on the faces of both there dawned the look of those for whom the world had suddenly turned back through 25 years, and for whom the bluebirds sang with all the ecstasy of long past springs. End of section 2. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 3 of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. Section 3, A No Quorum Night, by L. A. Leonard. Anyone who belonged to the old Eastern Lyceum will be sure to preserve a vivid recollection of the gatherings of that famous body, and above all of the genial presiding officer. That dignitary, Mr. Mat Spencer, was an old man in those days, a little rising 70, but he was as jolly as the most youthful, and enjoyed a good story as thoroughly as did any of the young men with whom he delighted to associate. Usually our meetings were so well attended as to leave little time for any save the serious objects for which the Lyceum existed. So it was an extraordinary occasion when, one night, a driving storm kept away so many of the faithful that the customary quorum failed to show up. That the dozen present, however, must have embraced some pretty good material, I feel sure, for as I look back, I remember that they included a future United States Senator, 2 or 3 able lawyers, 1 or 2 future successful newspaper and literary men, and 1 man who has since held half a dozen prominent positions in his state. Naturally, with such a gathering, even a no-quorum meeting couldn't prove tame. And though the regular programme was out of the question, a discussion of Shakespeare's intention concerning the character of Iago was to have been in order, it was unanimously voted to devote the evening to storytelling, with the result that our narratives gradually took on an impressiveness in keeping with the temper of the night. After various yarn spinnings, whose subjects don't matter here, someone turned to Mr. Spencer with a request for one of his famous tales. A look of serious intentness deepened the lines in the old man's face as he glanced around to see if the rest of us were equally anxious for a story from him. Of course we were. Reaching for his old pipe and pulling off a few scales of tobacco from the plug that had become well dried in the drawer of his table, he pushed them into the bowl and asked for a match. After the pipe was sufficiently started so that it could be held between his thumb and forefinger without going out as he reached the most interesting passages, he began. "This is the one ghost story," said he, "which is duly authenticated and certified to by the records of a court. I heard my father tell it, and he heard it direct from his father, who was alive when the incidents happened and the case was tried. In those days the county of Talbot embraced the entire peninsular part of Maryland, and although the legal matters took place in Easton, the Osbornes lived in that part of the state which now forms the county of Kent." Mr. Osborne was a highly respected Englishman, who had come to this country with his 5 boys for the purpose of bettering his fortunes. The sons had grown up, and by their united efforts the family had become large landowners. His extensive estate was divided into 2 parts, Glenham and Willow Crest, which lay some 6 miles apart. Both were excellent property in colonial days, but Glenham was the more valuable of the 2. Mr. Osborne died, and Peter, the eldest son, attempted in the county court to establish a verbal will by which Glenham was to be left to him, and Willow Crest to be divided among the other sons. The will was a very unfair one, as we regard things today, but under the English idea of primogeniture, which was firmly fixed in the people's minds, such an arrangement was not unusual in those days. So, though in a mild way Peter's brothers resisted his efforts to establish the will, No great bitterness was shown on either side, and the indications were that Peter would win his case and secure possession of Glenham. But the case was postponed from week to week until, finally, Peter came to court one Tuesday morning with a look of consternation on his face, avowing his purpose of withdrawing from the effort to establish the will. When court opened, he said he was there with some witnesses to prove a most extraordinary incident, and that he desired to withdraw the non-cuputane will which he had attempted to set up, and to ask that his father's estate be equally divided among the children. Then he told the following remarkable story, and established the truth of it by witnesses whom he had brought. While at work in the field the other day, 2 neighbours were walking along with me towards the turning row. We were discussing the will and the probabilities of my success. As we approached the end of the row, my father suddenly appeared at the side of the fence. He said to me in a clear and distinct voice, "Peter, don't do that. Don't try to rob your brothers in that way. You know I never intended that it should be done." While he spoke, my 2 neighbours, Mr. Hale and Mr. Cressup, heard the voice and understood every word that he said. When he ceased speaking, he laid his hand on the top rail of the fence, and we all saw the smoke arise from it. A moment later he was gone, but the prints of the forefinger and thumb were distinctly burned into the rail. I have brought the rail with me that the judge may examine it, and Mr. Hale and Mr. Cressup are both ready to testify to the truth of what I have said. It is recorded that the judges examined the rail and heard the testimony of the 2 witnesses, both of whom testified to having heard the voice, although neither of them saw the figure of Squire Osborne as did Peter. And furthermore, when this case was being recorded by the clerk of the court, a drop of blood fell upon the book as the last word was written, and this drop of blood may be examined today on the oldest record book of this county. End of section 3. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 4 of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897, Section 4, Tim Halliday's Baby, by Erskine M. Hamilton. There were sounds of lamentation in Nineveh, not the ancient city of that name, but a straggling western settlement of a dozen or more shanties of rough board construction, situated by the side of a railroad, with high wooded bluffs behind and a river flowing peacefully below. A Nineveh whose inhabitants were exclusively Irish, and the male inhabitants whereof were all in the employ of the railroad company, on whose land their little homes were temporarily erected. Naturally, in so small a community, everybody knew more of his neighbor's affairs than of his own, and everybody knew Tim Halliday, and especially Tim Halliday's baby. Therefore the lamentations, for on this special day Tim Halliday's baby was lost. To be sure, this was not the first time that the baby had proved a source of public anxiety, for he seemed born to mysterious happenings, so much so, indeed, that some of the worthy matrons of Nineveh had begun to regard him as uncanny and out of the usual order of nature. Already he had been nearly drowned in a cistern, had hung himself in a blackberry bush, had fallen over a 30-foot precipice, and had gone through various other perilous adventures, any one of which would have killed an ordinary baby. But out of them all he had emerged unscathed, and his sturdy little feet still toddled along perilous ways, and his innocent blue eyes still sought other dangers to wander into. This time, however, he was lost. The last knowledge of him dated back to the early morning, when he had been seen by a neighbor near a clump of blackberry bushes not far from his mother's door. After that, he could not be found, and great was the woe in Nineveh over his disappearance. With grief enveloping her rotund person, Mrs. McQuaid walked over to Mrs. Halliday's door to condole.
"Anne, isn't it sad indeed," she remarked, "to see the sweet boy taken from under his very nose when you was not looking?"
Mrs. Halliday did not reply, but sat in her low doorway, rocking backwards and forward, and giving vent to loud expressions of anguish. Several of her neighbors stood about her, red-eyed, offering such comfort as they could.
"But he'll come back all right,"
continued Mrs. McQuaid reassuringly.
"That baby's got a charm on him I can't know, and he'll be home presently."
In spite of this soothing prophecy, he did not come, however, and one after another the searching parties returned with no news of the missing infant. All through the day the exploration was kept up without avail. But late in the afternoon, as the sun was sinking behind the bluffs, an astounding thing happened. Mrs. Halliday had just stepped to the door in reply to a call from a passing neighbor, when behold, as she looked down the path, there stood the baby.
"The saints be praised,"
she cried, half sobbing, as she rushed out and caught him to her breast. In a moment all Nineveh was agog, and Mrs. McQuaid and Mrs. O'Toole, Mrs. McDermott, and others of the town's amiable matrons were on the spot, and overwhelming the happy mother with congratulations that were honest and sincere.
"It do be just as I told yez,"
asserted Mrs. McQuaid in an aside to Mrs. O'Toole.
"That child will come to no harm. Mind that now. He was born with a spell on him, and is under protection." "The Lord save us, and is it so?"
ejaculated Mrs. O'Toole, piously crossing herself.
"Yes, that be it. Sure, and Mrs. Halliday, what's the child got in his hand?"
Mrs. Halliday, who was busily talking to the others, turned at that question and looked at the baby's hand. The small pink fist was tightly closed about something, and upon its being pried open, a silver dollar fell to the ground. For a moment the group were too astonished to speak. Mrs. McQuaid's tongue was the first to be unloosed.
"The devil fly away with me. Where in the name of the blessed saints do ye be thinking he got that?"
No one could answer, and no one made reply. Mrs. Halliday could offer no explanation. Silver dollars were not very plentiful in Nineveh, and when and where the baby had secured one was a mystery. Questioning the child had no effect.
"Baby's hungry,"
was all that the grave mite would say, and the matter had to rest there. Several days passed uneventfully, and then again it was announced that Tim Halliday's baby was lost. This time his absence was not so prolonged, for after several hours' search, Mrs. McQuaid found him asleep under a blackberry bush. The good lady picked him up triumphantly and carried him to his mother, when, with great volubility, she began to explain how she came to find him. But in the midst of her vehemence, she stopped suddenly, as 2 silver dollars slipped from the baby's hand and jingled to the floor. Mrs. McQuaid looked at Mrs. Halliday, and Mrs. Halliday looked at Mrs. McQuaid.
"Mrs. Halliday,"
began Mrs. McQuaid.
I'm thinking this be queer doings, and I'm just going out of here. That's what I am."
And with almost unseemly haste, the good lady hurried from the room. Mrs. Halliday sat down on the floor and looked at her baby with something akin to awe.
"Well,"
she soliloquized,
"they do be saying he's under protection, but whether the saints or the devil do be sending them silver dollars, I can't know."
And no one knew, and the mystery grew in Nineveh. As for the baby, he wandered about in his innocent way, finding amusement wherever he could, and entirely unconscious of the excitement he had produced. Not so his mother. The feeling of awe that first smote her at the sight of the second supply of silver dollars so possessed her mind that for days she followed up her small son like a detective shadowing a suspected character. So passed 5 days, a week, 10 days, and Nineveh had just begun to draw a free breath once more when, presto, the Halliday baby disappeared again as if by magic. While his mother was busy inside the shanty, he had been out of her sight for a few minutes, and when she looked for him, he was nowhere to be found. Angry at herself for her lack of watchfulness, Mrs. Halliday sat down in a corner of the room to think and wonder. This time, however, only an hour or so passed, when through the bright sunlight of the open doorway toddled the baby, and running straight to his mother, dropped a silver dollar into her lap. This was too much. Worried and weeping, Mrs. Halliday placed the money where she had put the rest of the mysterious treasure, on a shelf under the picture of St. Patrick, and then hurried to the domicile of Mrs. McQuaid to talk the matter over with her.
"Mrs. McQuaid,"
she began pleadingly,
"it's hurted I am with all this trouble. It gives me a pain in me heart."
And in her uncertainty as to the anatomical position of that organ, she clasped her hands across her stomach.
"Well," said Mrs. McQuaid,
with an oracular emphasis,
"it's meself as has been thinking about the same, and I've been discussing the matter with Mrs. O'Toole and Mrs. McDermott. Mrs. O'Toole, she be thinking he be haunted by a banshee, and we'd better be seeing Father Murphy about it." "What woman?"
interrupted Mrs. Halliday indignantly.
"There be no banshees in America. They all do be in the old country." "That's what I told Mrs. O'Toole,"
answered Mrs. McQuaid.
"and I asked her how could they get here, and she says they just do be coming over, invisible like, on board the ships, like other folk." "Well, my child have no banshee, that's what,"
declared Mrs. Halliday with emphasis.
"Of course not. If he do, he's the devil's own banshee for bringing silver dollars. I'd like one myself like that,"
replied Mrs. McQuaid soothingly.
But anyway, we all thought that it would be a good thing to go to the city and ask Father Murphy for a charm to put on the child's neck.
To Mrs. Halliday, now so alarmed at the uncanny happenings that had befallen her small son, that she was ready to adopt almost any plan for relief, the idea seemed one to be grasped at. So straight to Father Murphy, in a nearby town, Tim Halliday went the very next morning, and told the story of the baby's mysterious doings. But when he explained the object of his quest to the priest, that reverend gentleman only laughed. "Get along home with you," he said. "If it's the silver dollars you're afraid of, it's the saints sent 'em. Mind that now. And tell Mrs. Halliday to hope they'll send more. The idea of two fools asking for a charm to keep away the blessings of heaven! Who ever heard of the like?" Meantime, while Tim Halliday was interviewing Father Murphy, new mysteries had developed in Nineveh. Incidentally, Tim Halliday's baby had disappeared, but that was to be expected, and it was supposed that he would turn up all right with the usual silver dollar. But he didn't. The event that had so roused the small settlement was this. About 11 o'clock, Mrs. McQuaid came running out of her shanty, wringing her hands and crying bitterly. Indeed, her anguish was so loud and vehement that Mrs. O'Toole, Mrs. McDermott, Mrs. Halliday, and all the other ladies of Nineveh came out to discover the cause.
"Anne, what's the matter with thee?"
questioned Mrs. O'Toole, hurrying forward and placing her hands sympathizingly on Mrs. McQuaid's shoulder.
"Is it the misery in the stomach?" "No, it's more fearsome than that,"
moaned Mrs. McQuaid.
"I've been robbed."
"Robbed!" ejaculated all of the ladies in a breath.
"Yes, that's the way it be,"
replied Mrs. McQuaid, wiping her eyes with her apron.
"I've been saving up some money this while back for Barney and me to start in some little business for ourselves when we should be ready for it. Of course, the bank's in town to be breaking, as we all know, and I thought it would be a deal safer to keep the money myself. So the fool that I was, I did that same." "And how did ye lose it?"
broke in Mrs. O'Toole.
"It's myself as is coming to that,"
pursued Mrs. McQuaid with a slight show of dignity.
"You'll know that when we built the shanty, we put it over a big hole that was already there, because it made an elegant cellar to keep potatoes and the like. I can't know who digged the hole in the first place, but the back end of it was boarded up at the time we found it. With it then, I pulled one of them boards loose and put me money in behind in an old tea kettle. Well, fool that I was, I kept putting in the money in there, mostly in silver, until such times as we should need it. But today, when I went to look for it, I found some thieving villain had dug a tunnel from the other way and took most of the money." "And why didn't he steal it all?"
asked Mrs. Halliday excitedly.
"It's yourself that can answer that as well as me,"
responded Mrs. McQuaid in accents of deep gloom.
"The thief left the tea kettle and some small change in it. Bad cess to him."
Several of the ladies' husbands had joined the group by this time, and had heard the tale of woe. Among them was Mr. O'Toole. As he listened, his face suddenly brightened. "We never thought of it until now, about that tunnel," he said, "but I think I have the explaining of it. It's an old coal mine. Pat Driscoll, who lives down by the water tank, told me once that years back the railroad had run a tunnel back into the hill and used to run the coal out on small cars to the track. After a bit, they quit working and boarded up the end of the tunnel. And I'm thinking, Mrs. McQuaid, that's the fine cellar that ye have. It's at the end of the old mine."
"But who was the thief of the money?"
interrupted Mrs. McQuaid. This, however, Mr. O'Toole could not explain, and after a few discursive remarks, the whole party repaired to Mrs. McQuaid's cellar to investigate. A little vigorous effort in removing the boards revealed the opening behind, where Mrs. McQuaid had so carefully concealed her treasure, and also verified the statement of Mr. O'Toole. There was the tunnel, sure enough, with the timber supports yet in position, and a portion of the car track in place at the bottom. As the party stood looking into the tunnel, there emerged from the darkness a small figure whose wide blue eyes viewed them with innocent wonder, and whose small hands were hidden behind his back. It was the Halliday baby. For a moment the surprise was so great that its mother almost fainted, while Mrs. O'Toole and Mrs. McDermott piously crossed themselves. Not so with Mrs. McQuaid. Seized by a sudden inspiration, she rushed forward and caught up the child in her arms.
"The saints be praised!"
she exclaimed.
"This be the thief that's got the money. I can't know. Look at his hands."
Sure enough, the little pink fists were clasped tightly about some silver coins, and upon going into the tunnel, Mr. O'Toole soon found, a short distance away, a small opening to the surface above. At some time, the baby had discovered this opening, which was in a thick clump of blackberry bushes near his mother's door, and through it he had made his frequent disappearances, returning thence laden with treasure. Thus the mystery of the robbery and the silver dollars was explained, and in spite of Father Murphy's refusal of a charm, peace was restored to Nineveh, and the spell lifted from Tim Halliday's baby. End of section 4. Read by Kerry Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 20th of June, 2022.
Section 5 of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897. Ezra Collingford's Figure 4 Trap, by William Maynadier Browne. Imagine a diffident, silent, spare but well-built and erect little white-haired, white-bearded man of, say, 60. A man with those easily interested and trustful eyes you sometimes meet in a child's gaze. His were china blue. With that absolute modesty you sometimes find in a wise, uncomely girl. With that complete distrustfulness of self you sometimes see in an ungainly, thoughtful, clever country boy. Imagine these qualities combined in a little elderly man who had captained sailing vessels for nearly 20 years, and had never lost a ship. Then you may form a picture, in your mind's eye, of Captain Ezra Collingford of Machias, Maine. Now, imagine Captain Ezra's exact physical opposite. Then you may easily see Captain Lester Hawkes, roughly but firmly knit, lantern-jawed and cold-eyed. If Captain Lester Hawkes had anything to say, he never hesitated to say it, and to say it in such words as allowed of no misunderstanding. He was as sure of himself as he was of the polar needle. Yet, for years, he had been sailing under Captain Ezra Collingford as first mate, though he had previously sailed as captain and was entitled to the prefix. The two were the closest of friends. I, as a boy in Machias, knew them both, for they were old friends of my father's while he was alive. He, too, was a seafaring man. To me, as a boy, Captain Ezra, small as he was an object of reverence and awe. Nobody could make such neat, fascinating, perfectly delightful things with tools. Nobody had such wonderful deftness in the use of the jackknife as Captain Ezra had. And part and parcel of the sea though he was, he knew more about making and setting traps than anybody who spent his life ashore. I liked the woods more than I did the sea. Many was the time the captain would, while on some spell ashore, wander inland with me, and show me what he called his idea of rigging a trap. I shall never forget the deftness, the neatness, and the sureness with which he made for me the best figure-4 trap I have ever seen, and the delight of the day when he took me up to his own private little den where he slept in his neat house will remain with me as long as I live. He was a widower with one child, a girl about my own age, cared for and brought up, during his trips at sea, by his unmarried sister who lived with him. But the charm of that room of his, on neat shelves and quaint brackets of his own making, ranged about the walls, were models of boats of all conceivable rigs, complete to the smallest detail, and each so beautiful in its completeness that I looked and looked in speechless wonder. Then he showed me, on the wall near the head of his bed, a miniature arrow, and while I was looking, it veered slightly, as it pointed midway between the south and west of the dial behind it. "It's rigged onto a vane on the roof," he said. "It's sort of foolishness," he added with a chuckle, as I stood wrapped in admiration. Then my keen boy's eyes caught sight of a puzzling contrivance directly over a bracket lamp not far from the arrow. "What's that for, Captain?" I asked. "Well, George," he answered, "sometimes I kind of read in bed, and that there's a rig I fixed so's to put out the lamp 'thout tumbling out. They tell me it's sort of bad to read in bed, but I don't know. Here, I'll show you." He lighted the kerosene lamp, reached behind the head of his small wooden bedstead, and pulled a string that was, unseen by me, hanging there. It was all done quickly and quietly. As he pulled the string, a small fan-shaped piece of leather attached to the end of a slender wooden arm descended exactly, and with just the right amount of force, upon the open top of the lamp chimney, then sprang back into its former position. The flame in the lamp went out. I exclaimed, "Captain, that's great!" He caught me by the arm, not roughly at all, and shook me a little. "I believe you got as great a love for puttering as I have," he said, and laughed aloud. When I was nearly grown, I went to Boston to work in a store. Why or how it happened is no part of this story, but before long I found myself a member of the force of detective police, and at the time of which I write had risen to be a sergeant of the division. One day when, to kill time, I was reading every word of the morning newspaper, I came across in the shipping news a line or so stating that the three-master, Sarah L. Tillotson, of Machias, Maine, Collingford captain, had earned quite a sum, as salvage, for towing a big Australian freighter, disabled by bad weather, into Rio Janeiro, and that this same Sarah L. Tillotson had passed Boston Light the afternoon before, bound for Boston. At this moment, the office messenger entered my room. "There are 2 men outside to see you, sir." "Who are they?" I asked. "They didn't give their names. Said you'd know them, sir." "What do they look like?" "Well, sir," the messenger answered, with the beginning of a smile in the corners of his mouth, "they look like the long and short of it, just ashore from a voyage." "Show 'em in," I said, and was quite prepared to see, as I did, my father's old friends enter a moment later. "How do you do?" said Captain Ezra shyly. "Well, my son, how be ye?" said Captain Lester in his inflexible, resonant voice. He had always addressed me as my son, as he invariably did any younger man whom he liked. If he didn't like him, he used no form of address whatever, simply looked him in the eye and spoke. He rarely called anybody by name. I had heard him occasionally address Captain Ezra as Collie, but it was in moments of great earnestness, or of as near an approach to hilarity as Captain Lester ever allowed himself. We shook hands. As often happens in the case of a big man, Captain Lester gave no responsive grip whatever. His hand in mine felt like a big leather glove that had dried hard after a thorough wetting had been stuffed with sand. Captain Ezra, on the contrary, gave me a quick, warm, firm pressure of the hand. The upshot of it all was that they took supper with me that evening in a cozy restaurant I used to frequent, and over a glass or 2 of rum and water, with just a touch of molasses, told me all about themselves and their plans. "So, my son," said Captain Lester finally, slowly stirring his drink, "you see how 'tis. It's a matter of 5,000 apiece for Collie and me. And what's more, we've got the money, the bills, all safe and tight." And here he let his big, hard hand fall upon my knee, and gripped and shook it gently. "Ain't it so, Collie?" "Yes," said Captain Ezra for a reply, quietly, with a slow, acquiescing nod of the head. "Well, what are you going to do now?" I asked. "That's just it. You listen," said Captain Lester. I listened. "He's," with a jerk of his big thumb towards Captain Ezra, "going to ride out to Estella in Denver. And if everything's fit, he's going out there for a spell to stay along of her and her husband and the children." I must mention here that, much to Captain Ezra's delight, his daughter Estella had, some years before, married a young city man, who, having come into Machias aboard a hired yacht, had met, fallen in love with, proposed to, and been accepted by his daughter. Arthur Crane his name was, and the good little captain had always cherished a certain amount of pride because Estella was married to a financial man, for Crane had some years before gone to Denver to become cashier of a bank, which his employer, at the time, started there. "Children?" I asked. "I thought there was only one." Captain Ezra held up 2 fingers, and smiled, and nodded. Something about him, I can't tell you what, conveyed the idea, too, that the children would have money in the bank some day. "Yes, sir," continued Captain Lester, "he's a-going out to Denver to see him," with another jerk of his thumb towards Captain Ezra, accompanied this time by merely turning over his big hand, which now lay, gnarled and brown, before him on the table. "But, afore that, he wants to have his fling." Here Captain Lester turned and slowly winked at Captain Ezra, and Captain Ezra smiled as he passed the back of his hand across his shaven upper lip. "Yes, sir. Wants to spend 2-3 weeks here in Boston, looking round and eating at hotels." "That's it?" Captain Ezra nodded. "Then go to Denver, then back to port, and take the Sarah L. again." Captain Lester leaned back in his chair and gazed at me sternly, as if I were a questionable sky. "Who's going to sail the Sarah L. in the meantime?" I asked. "I be," replied Captain Lester, and spat neatly. "Seen the owner this morning. Signed, Floridy Lumber. Month or thereabouts, maybe. Consigned here to Boston. Then he takes her again, same as afore. All understood, fair and above board." "I see," I said. "Now, my son," said Captain Lester, leaning forward, his elbows on the table, "I want you to look after him. He wants a snug place to bunk. Not meals. He's calculated to get them at hotels. He wants a place where the money he has with him won't be in no danger whatsoever." "The money?" I exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, my son, the money," Captain Lester repeated. "His'n and mine. He's got both stowed away in his clothes." Captain Lester leaned back in his chair and stared at me hard, after having thrust his hands deep into his trousers pockets. He rocked slowly back and forth on the hind legs of his chair. "Why don't you deposit it?" I asked in amazement. He shook his head. I argued. Captain Lester turned as smoothly from every argument I advanced as the rudder post of the Sarah L. turned in response to the pressure of his big hand upon the wheel. But he was, after all was said, as inflexible in his mental direction as the rudder post was in its mechanical limits. "No, my son," he said at last, "I don't know no banks near's well as I do Collie." "But what do you intend to do with this money when you come back?" I asked. "Build a coaster, bean't we?" he said, glancing at Captain Ezra. "Well, I guess," said Captain Ezra, with the nearest approach to assurance I had ever seen in him. "Call her the Estella C, too," said Captain Lester, and again he spat unobtrusively. "If you say so," said Captain Ezra bashfully. "Well, I do say so," replied Captain Lester, as if he were ready and anxious to do battle for his choice. Meanwhile, I had been thinking. A friend of mine, Jack Fitzgerald, a young lawyer, had a room at the West End, never mind what street it was on, call it North Perry Street. It was in one of the houses that used to be the mansions of the Boston merchants years ago. Low-studded and wainscoted, simply wainscoted with broad, smooth, painted panels, but sunny, and in a quiet, decent neighborhood, one of those forgotten neighborhoods that, when you visit them, make you say to yourself as you stand and dream about it, why in the world did they leave this to build on? But it's no matter. It was a lovely old house and a lovable old room. Jack was away, was out west for 2 months on business, and though his room was vacant, he still retained it. That night, the captain slept aboard the Sarah L., but the next day I received a telegram from Jack in reply to a half-rate one of mine sent the night before, which read, "May old friend of mine use your room for 2 weeks." Jack's answer was like him himself, short, sharp, and satisfactory. All it said was, "Sure, Jack." In due time I stowed away, to use his own expression, Captain Ezra, together with his tin cash box, in Jack's room, and Captain Lester sailed south for his cargo of lumber. Then I let the little captain alone for a few days to have his fling. At length I called upon him to see how he was getting along, and how he stood eating at hotels. I found him in, but, mercy, what a change! Instead of my clear-eyed, childlike, gentle Captain Ezra, I found a pale, haggard, bent, and, what was far worse, mumbling old man. I threw my arm about him and begged him to tell me what was the trouble. For a moment he seemed like himself. He patted me on the shoulder, shook me by the hand, laughed, or tried to, and said he was just as well as ever he was. But the next moment he became again the wreck I had found him. With the utmost gentleness I tried to question him, but all's to no purpose. He always came back to the same reply. "Just as well as I ever was, George. Don't you worry." The pitiful attempt at a laugh that always followed my expressions of anxiety brought my heart into my mouth, and the look in his eyes, part terror, part sadness, all despair, pierced it like a knife. Instinctively I glanced about the room. It was the same as when Jack left it, the night I saw him off, except that here and there, in places where it could be done without disturbing Jack's belongings, the captain had put things of his own, sea things, curiosities, queer relics of voyages. For instance, on the low, narrow mantel-shelf that ran along above an old-fashioned broad open fireplace, I noticed, in spaces hitherto unused, a bronze Japanese figure, an East Indian idol in miniature, and so on in various spots about the room, though not in many. Evidently, Captain Ezra had tried to make the room homelike, but, as ever, had been careful not to interfere. I noticed, too, his tin cash-box under the head of the bed. It occurred to me that here might lie the trouble. But no, he assured me, with the first semblance of real alertness he had shown, that it was safe and sound. Indeed, he now became, for him, positive and insistent, even more so than was necessary, that the cash-box and its contents were all right. Finally, I gave it up, decided to come over again the next day, and took my leave. The next day I called. He was out. I called again and again. He was always out, and the door of his room was always locked. Then I questioned the landlady, whom I knew to be a reliable woman. But really he was such a quiet little man, and made so little trouble, she hadn't noticed, except that once he had asked her if there were a hardware store handy, and that when he came back, after having gone out for an hour or so, he was carrying a heavy bundle. At last I found him in once more. It was several days later, and again I was surprised at the change in his appearance. He was not my Captain Ezra, to be sure, but he was nearer to it. He seemed more alive, less dejected, and what I, by force of habit, I suppose, especially noted, less haunted by fear. But there was an eagerness, an alertness, a restlessness about him I did not like. This time I took a new tack. I asked him what he had heard from his daughter. To this he replied, with even added eagerness, that she was first rate as she could be. I asked him when he expected to go to her. He looked anywhere but at me, so unlike him, and went back to the mumbling. At length the mumbling resolved itself into coherence, and I distinguished words. Long journey. Sort of thought I'd wait till Leicester reached port. Stay ashore a spell longer, maybe. All of which ended in a laugh intended to convey the impression of nonchalance, and failing utterly to do so. But now his manner changed with marked suddenness. He became almost keen. "You're a detective?" he asked. "Of course," I replied, for I knew he knew it. "Will you read that?" he said, and thrust a letter at me. It was printed in pen and ink, on ordinary stationery such as you might buy at a corner thread-needle shop. I read these words: "Captain, we know you got the money, yours and his'n. Meet us on Portland Street at 9 p.m. on the 15th, and give it up, or you will be a dead man next day." There was no signature. At last I knew. My poor old Captain Ezra was slowly but surely being frightened to death. I laughed aloud in my joy, for I knew that if any man could protect and comfort him, I could. I soothed and reassured him. I asked him for the envelope, but unfortunately he had destroyed it. We sat late into the night discussing a plan at my suggestion. The 15th was 2 days ahead, and Captain Ezra finally agreed, in response to my request, to walk the length of Portland Street at 10 p.m. on that night. Of course I meant to have my men carefully stationed. Throughout our talk he was much more like himself, and, with a weight off my mind, I left him. I was sure of my ground now. I called again the next day to again reassure him. He had received another letter, printed like the first, and on the same kind of paper. It said only this: "Remember, if you don't, you're a dead man on the 16th. Again there was no signature, but this time he had preserved the envelope. The letter had been mailed in South Boston, but the time was too short to watch mailboxes, so this information was, to a degree, immaterial. Once more I sat with Captain Ezra and talked over the plan. Everything was arranged, and he agreed to every arrangement. He was like, yet strangely unlike, himself. "I see by this morning's paper," he said abruptly, "that the Sarah L. was off Hatteras yesterday, bound home. Lester'll be here on the 16th. I was glad of that, and told him so. When I left him he was almost like himself in every way. The night of the 15th was warm and clear, with a full moon shining. Hard on our friends, the murderers, I thought to myself as the captain and I walked to his rendezvous. We carried out our programme to the letter. Captain Ezra walked Portland Street from end to end, apparently alone, but always guarded. and not a soul did he meet. Evidently our quarry had smelled a rat and had taken flight. As I walked back to the room with the captain, we talked the matter over and decided to await developments. He agreed that it would be best to stay in his room the next day, the 16th, and I assured him that the house would be carefully guarded. As I left him at the door, I laughed off the whole affair. When I bade him good night, he held out his hand and said, in the same quiet, bashful way I'd always until recently known, "Well, good night, George. I know you'll take care of me, and you and Lester. Somehow I sort of feel as if it might happen, though, tomorrow." I again reassured him, and after seeing him safely indoors, went home. He didn't know it, but 2 of my men were at that moment on the watch, and remained so all that night. The next morning I was on the ground again. Nothing whatever had happened, my men told me. As I was talking with them, I felt a weight on my shoulder. I turned and found the explanation. The weight was Captain Lester's hand, and I heard his level voice saying, "Well, my son, how be ye?" He had made the wharf early that morning, and had come directly to his old friend. We entered the house together and went to Captain Ezra's door. I knocked. No answer. "Well, guess that hotel eatin' makes him sleepy," said Captain Lester. "Give me a turn." And he knocked 3 times with his great brine-hardened knuckles. It was enough to wake the dead, and, God help us, that was what was needed. The door was not locked. We went in. The bright, warm sunlight was streaming into the room, and little Captain Ezra was sitting peacefully in the armchair near the corner of the open fireplace. I saw at a glance the small, round, dark blue spot in the center of his forehead. Captain Lester reached the chair first. And then I heard what I pray I may never hear again, the sounds of a great, big, simple heart in abject grief. He knelt by Captain Ezra and fondled the hand resting on the arm of the chair. The other was hanging limp. "Golly, son, 'tain't true. Say it 'tain't true. Oh, Christ!" And he bowed his head and sobbed aloud. I waited. Then I touched him on the shoulder. "Captain," I said, "this is murder." He was on his feet in an instant. "Murder?" he whispered, looking at me. "Murder?" His voice was now like low, distant thunder. He turned and for the first time saw the bullet hole in Captain Ezra's forehead. "By the eternal God, who done it?" These words came from him as if they were the last gasp from some overtaxed, exhausted, mighty engine. He looked a giant as he stood there, his arms at his sides, but each bent inward and his great fists clenched. "Who done it, I say?" he repeated, but this time with a snarl like a tortured lion's. "That we must find out," I said as gently as I could. "We must be calm, first of all, and see what we can find." "Right, my son," he groaned. "I'm calm now." And he was. But his face, it was scarred by awful grief already. "The cash box, see!" I exclaimed. We hurried to the bed together. Near it lay the box, open and empty, save for one single paper, a letter. I started to take it from the box, but Lester Hawks was quicker than I. In an instant he had it and read the address. I had read it too. It was addressed to him. He turned to me and said 3 words. "You sat down." I sat down. Standing where he was, he opened the letter and read. There was an enclosure. He read that too. As he read, he breathed hard through his teeth and sobbed. While he was reading, I had time to collect my thoughts, and started to my feet to call my men from the window. Again came the 3 words, and I sat down. At last he raised his gaunt hand from the papers. He walked to the armchair and passed round it to the side near the fireplace, looking at the floor. He stooped and pointed at what I had not, in my distress, noticed before. Beneath the limp arm that hung down lay a piece of white twine on the floor, in many S's, L's, and O's, as if it had been jerked there. Then he stared at me, a long, agonized, hopeless stare. At last he spoke, and all he said was, "You keep setting down." He looked closely at the old-fashioned carving that formed the outer edge of the mantelpiece itself. Next he looked at his dead friend and sighed. Then he went to the further side of the fireplace and felt carefully along the molding bordering a large panel that evidently to me, knowing as I did these old houses, covered some unused space beside the chimney breast. His examination was short. He gave me a look as he finished, and his look plainly repeated his last 4 words. He went quickly to the closet near the bed, returning immediately carrying a few simple tools. I saw they were new. Quickly and neatly his bulky hands did his bidding. Moldings, boards, finally the panel itself came off, and all almost without a sound. He was between me and what he was doing. He spoke over his shoulder. "Lock that door." I did it. "Look here." I came to his side and looked into the opening. "See," he said. His voice was deep and quiet. I saw it all at a glance. In the pattern of the carving were recurrent, deep, circular depressions. One of these had been bored through, forming a hole which led into the space behind the panel. Pointing through this hole, with fatal accuracy, was a revolver, lashed in place with infinite neatness. For the rest, I saw nothing but a heavy iron weight, a few slender sticks notched as for a figure 4 trap, and a piece of string, all lying together on the floor at the bottom of the space behind the panel. That was all I saw, but I knew. "Sit down," said Captain Lester. As I did so, he drew toward him a chair and sat down himself, exactly facing me. "Now you listen." He took from his pocket, where he had carefully placed them, the papers we found in the box. "This is from him," he said, "to me, but I'll read it to you." Then he read as follows. "Lester, I ain't been murdered. I done it myself. I stole your money and don't dare to face you. Before reading further, please read the letter from Estella enclosed herein." Here he opened and read the enclosure. "Dear Father, we are in fearful trouble, and I write to you for help. Don't blame Arthur. He has always been a good husband to me, and I love him dearly. He has taken money from the bank to speculate with, and, oh, Father, I know it will kill you with grief. We've got to have $10,000 at once, or Arthur will have to go to jail. Think of me and the children, Father dear, and help us if you can. Estella." Without comment, Captain Lester returned to the letter from his friend. "Now, Lester, you know why I done it. My last wish is that she should always think I've been murdered. If she should find out I done just what her husband did, it would break her heart. She's all right now. I sent her your money and mine. If you can find it in your heart to do what I ask, you will much oblige. Ezra, Collingford." When Captain Lester had finished reading, he carefully refolded the papers and put them back in his pocket. Then he turned to me. "You stand up," he said as he rose himself. I stood. He placed a hand on each of my shoulders. I felt his grip then. I can feel it still. "My son," he said, looking down into my eyes, "there's just 2 men knows about this. Just as soon as any more knows it, one of them 2 has got to die if I have to kill him. What do you say?" For answer, I held up my hand. "Wouldn't you have?" He threw his arms about me, and we cried like children. Then we quietly destroyed all evidence of suicide and replaced the panel and molding. That finished, I glanced hurriedly through the writing desk. I didn't find much, merely a piece of blotting paper upon which some handwritten letters, reversed, were visible. I could easily make out EADMAN. In a drawer I found, also, a few sheets of paper like that used in the captain's letters. Then I went out and gave my men instructions in regard to Captain Ezra Collingford's murder. Captain Lester went down with the Sarah L. in the great gale in '93. Both Estella and her husband are dead. Otherwise I should not have told this tale. End of Section 5. Recording by Todd. End of The Black Cat, Volume 2, Number 11, August 1897.